All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pizza Politics, Mr. Watson. I am your host, Christian Watson. And today, here with me, I have someone who I think is one of the most informative minds on issues of the woke and postmodernism, and most certainly on Derrida. I've never seen someone explain Derrida as he has. Wokal Distance. I've admired his work for a very, very long time, and I've wanted to get him on the show for a while. And I'm finally glad I was able to snag him. Wokal, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So before we get into anything a little bit too deep, just tell people, what is your background? What do you identify as ideologically, if you identify as anything ideologically, and how do both of those two things, your background and your ideological disposition, influence how you interact with the idea of wokeness and postmodernism and everything that it entails, this sort of an anathema, right, to normativity. How does this all tie in?
So I guess let's start with my academic background. I studied theology and philosophy academically, and then my background uh, included some time. I've done a lot of blue collar work, so hands in the earth, kind of calluses, really feet on the ground, having to be practical kind of work. And I've also spent some time in government, so I have some ideas about how governments work and governments function and some of the strengths and weaknesses that can show up in that situation. So I think ideologically, I would say I'm religiously a Christian. I am politically an Enlightenment liberal of some kind. I'm in the modern liberal tradition. I would say I would lean to the conservative side of that. I'm a Canadian, and so I'm a Canadian conservative, and that would mean that the policies that I would have been in favor of, let's say in the last election in Canada, would have been considered conservative in Canada, but I don't know that I could have, let's say, won a primary or won an election as a Republican in Texas. I just don't know that that's something. So it's in the Canadian or largely British Tory tradition
Mm.
would be a little closer to where I am than the Republican conservative tradition. But philosophically, I think there's a lot of common threads between those two.
Yeah, of course. And actually, let's touch on that point for a moment. There's always been this very interesting dichotomy in my mind between sort of European conservatism, or because conservatism is likely foreign to America, and American conservatism. There's this idea. This is an idea that is rejected by some people. I think someone like Ram Hazani may actually, scorn this idea that American conservatism was founded upon sort of Lockean principles of individual liberty and natural law. And so the American conservative project will be at the foundation concerned with preserving those things. And of course, there are other sort of incidental things that come along through that. Now, there are other kinds of conservatism, like the sort of non-foundationalist conservatism that Michael Oakeshott preaches, and the more traditionalist conservatism that Russell Kirk would preach, or the more, nationalistic identity-based conservatism that Ram Hazani would preach. So, in your estimation, a few questions actually, three probably. Number one, what do you think? Okay, do you think that American conservatism is founded on sort of Lockean principles, or is that a misattribution? Two, do you think that European conservatism differs significantly from American conservatism in its sort of principal beliefs, or Canadian conservatism for that matter? You don't touch the European if you don't want to. And if so, how? And number three, if there's any reconciliation to be made between those versions of conservatism, if they do indeed differ, if we've established that, what are they? Do you have any ideas about that? Because I've been wondering about this question for a very long time.
Um, so I think there's an academic discourse about this to be had, but I'm not going to approach this from a straightforwardly academic discourse
Okay.
or from an academic perspective. I don't want to kind of come in on that
Yeah.
route. I'm going to I'm going to say that there is in the United States a sense of really rugged individualism and distrust of government that is stronger than what happens in Canada or what happens in Europe.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think that's the Lockean part showing through. Well, maybe the Lockean, and maybe there's some Hobbes mixed in, but it's that sort of distrust of government is very strong just in American politics generally. I think that American conservatism has a sort of libertarian economic approach that I don't think, just off the top of my head, the Canadian and British and European conservatism has taken as strong. Certainly there's common ground on the need for things like lower taxes, that the government cannot spend the people's money as efficiently as the people can. But conservatives in Canada and Europe would be far less averse to allowing the government to carry out certain functions than the Americans would. Just as an example, Canadians and European conservatives are far less likely to object to things like emissions standards than, say, American conservatives would.
Interesting.
That's the first thing. The second thing is there are certain areas in which I don't think that the American conservatives are that far from, say, European conservatives. For example, on immigration, if there was a single European country that had on its border what is happening in the United States, you wouldn't see a single left-wing party in Europe get a single seat if that was happening. I cannot imagine, the Czech Republic or Sweden or Germany or France, having 1 million people or 2 million people on their border, or caravans of people coming through their border without seeing a strong shift to right-wing parties in Europe. So I think that the American concern with immigration and with a certain sort of job protectionism is something that would be common with European conservatism. Finally, I think that there's a difference in. So I think the Americans are more economically libertarian and have a stronger, have a much stronger bedrock of individualism than the European and Canadian and British counterparts.
Interesting.
And then I think that there are certain areas of agreement. The importance of tradition, on immigration policy, there's agreement. There's broadly agreement that the government spending should be kept in check. So-called fiscal responsibility, the avoidance of debt is something that's talked about across conservative circles, certainly. So yeah, I think there are some common principles and some common moral principles as well in terms of the protecting of the family. I think the Americans have a much stronger pro-life movement than exists in Europe at the moment. But I think I also think that that's probably in response to the fact that Europe is, despite not being nearly as pro-life, in many cases are far less permissive on abortion in European states than American liberals are. And again, that's the American liberals are very, very, very pro-choice, and that's that American individualism coming through, right? So I think those two things. And finally, I would say there's a difference because of the way that the governments are run. Canada and many countries, I would say most countries in Europe, and also Britain, India, a lot of these places use the Westminster parliamentary system, which is not only a first past the post system, but it's a situation where if a party gets a majority, there's no filibuster. So there's in the American system there's the three branches of government. There's the the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, and the legislative is split into the House and the Senate. So you have the House, the Senate, and the executive branch. If the opposition party captures one of those, it can slow things down immensely. And even if they don't capture one of those, if they can filibuster in the Senate, they can slow things down immensely. That kind of thing doesn't exist in Canada. If the Liberals or the Conservatives or the Socialists or whoever it is gets a majority government, there's no filibuster mechanism. And because the way that it operates is that the cabinet, which includes all of the ministers of the crown. So in the same way that you might have, say, a secretary of defense or a secretary of the interior or something like that, we would have government ministers which make up the government. So you'd have your majority party, which would be, let's say it's the Conservatives would have the majority party, and they would form the government. And the government would be formed of the various ministers of the various ministries. So there would be the Ministry of Finance, there would be the Ministry of Defense, there would be the Ministry of Health or whatever have you, and each member of Parliament, a member of the Legislative Assembly or whatever they're calling them in that particular system, would be in charge. So when you have a majority government and you control all the ministries, there's nothing that the opposition party can do to stop you from doing something. And for that reason, we don't have the kinds of fist fights that occur in the American system over things like the filibuster. That's just not there.
Right.
So I would say that that would map the territory, I think, interestingly.
And the reason I ask is because I find that in a lot of anti-woke discourse, a lot of people from various disjointed, disconnected, I would say, disparate seemingly, political ideologies are joined together on this one issue. But I find that that's where the similarity most of the time ends. A lot of people who appear to be against a lot of woke ideologies, most of them are salt of the earth people. They're parents, they're school teachers, they're people who happen to be in corporate America, or just people who just are trying to make a living, an honest living, and just live their life, take care of their families. And they see this woke stuff happening and they come against it. But I think many of them don't exactly have an ideological or philosophical foundation as to why they are coming against it beyond it simply being outrageous and shocking their sensibilities. Emerson said in an essay called Spiritual Laws that all man needs is a few good instincts and a few plain rules to live practically. He says that knowledge of Latin or how these higher ideas are not necessary. All that stuff is silly. Just forget about it. That's all you need is just the practical stuff of life. And there's something to be said about that, I think. There's something to be said. I think that actually is a principle that has motivated the American experiment. But I wonder if the founders of my country, America, had been motivated by that very simplistic idea of ethics and morality, if America would have been birthed from the complex traditions that preceded it, the natural law tradition, the logging tradition. Because these are things that a few plain rules, these are things that may create a few plain rules, don't harm people's property, don't harm their stuff, understand the importance of the human being, the human body to how we operate. But to get to those plain rules, you first have to have an ideological foundation. So I always thought that Emerson's recommendation, which didn't have anything to do with natural law, from my understanding, he was just talking about it in general, is being embodied by a lot of people, and it leaves a lot to be desired. We need to have the foundation, in my opinion, as to why a lot of woke ideologies are bad. It can't just be, well, this stuff seems crazy and shocking. It has to be more than that, in my opinion. Are my observations correct, in your opinion? And do you think, if they are correct, how do you think people can escape the sort of trap of being, ignorant of the ideological foundations of their objections? If it's not correct, then where do you think most people, or people who are typically against the woke and who come in to be against the woke, and they come from like fields that really don't have anything to do with politics or philosophy or anything like that, how do you think some of them, from your experience, may engage with this issue?
Just give me 1 second. I want to pull up a picture, which I think.
Oh, that's fine.
Let's see if we can pull it up here. That picture?
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, you see this all the time. This meme
It's a
hops
bell
out all
curve,
the
right?
time.
That's the bell curve, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you'll notice on the one side of the low side of the bell curve, right here, we have a guy and he's not real bright. Then you have this side here, and you got a guy who's a real genius, and then you got this guy here. And usually the way that this meme works is that these two guys agree on some really simple thing, and this guy wants oodles and oodles and oodles of evidence for the obvious. I think
Yeah,
I think we're in a little bit of that situation.
interesting.
I think in terms of practical everyday life, the simple rules work.
Yes, I agree with you.
I
Yes.
think the simple I now they can be difficult to justify philosophically. I mean, if I want to pull out the most rigorous um how do I put this? If I want to demand the most rigorous justifications, the same level of justification I would demand for, say, an engineering program or a science program, and I say, prove to me that getting married is better than not getting married if I'm going to have a family. That that that's a lot. That can
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
that can be a tough slog. If
Yes.
if there's I don't know what your situation is, but if you know anybody who's dating somebody and they've said, "Well, I'm thinking of getting married," and they demand the level of rigor in that decision of, say, an astrophysicist, we're looking up, we're barking up the wrong tree here.
Right.
That's not how those kinds of decisions are made.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of decisions in life which are made um, not with maximum information processed in the most rigorous manner,
Mm-hmm.
but rather decisions that are made on the basis of what one might call wisdom, having to know the specifics of the situation, the specific people involved, and then
Mm-hmm.
make a wise judgment that's
Mm-hmm.
not plugged into a really super rigorous formula and then peer reviewed. My
Right.
buddy got
Right.
married. He didn't, we didn't say, okay, well, give us the reasons that you're marrying this woman. We'll send it into the local journal. We'll get somebody to review the manuscript.
Yeah.
It might get desk rejected, in which case you'll have to call the wedding off. Like, that's not
Right.
how we do things in real life, right?
Of course not. But
That's not something that's so I think there's something, but I also think that there will be cases where the question of why do we think this
exactly.
is going to
Yes.
matter.
Yes.
And at that point, what we might want to do when someone says, well, why should we form families? We might want to talk about what happens with, say, fatherlessness,
Yes. Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I have a 6-year-old son, and at the risk of telling too much about my life, the relationship didn't work out. I I stayed in my son's life as a matter of being the dumb guy, where this is what we do because it's the right thing to do, and it was a simple decision. But I'm sure if we were to comb through all of the statistics and find out what would have happened to my son had I not stayed in his life and not, you know, put myself in a situation where um, we're in a 50-50 arrangement. If I wasn't that involved in his life, if I didn't go to all of his soccer games, if I didn't go to all of the various things that he's involved in, um, as soon as COVID stops, I'm going to try and enroll him in soccer. We'll see how well that goes. But
Oh, that's so
um,
wholesome.
yeah, if I wasn't involved, I'm sure if we did a rigorous scientific analysis of the lives of young men with no father involved, I'm sure we could set up a scientifically rigorous case for
Sure.
why
Right.
fathers should be involved. But I didn't wait for that scientific evidence to show up before I decided that I was going to raise my son as best I could.
Right.
I didn't
Of
say, well,
course.
let's just put him up for adoption. Who cares? Like, no. So I think there's a moral character issue there as well. And I think a lot of the stuff that's plainly obvious is plainly obviously is plainly obvious because it works, and it works well, and it works effectively for almost everyone.
Right.
And
And
since there's nothing that will work equally well for every single human being alive because we just can't make a perfect system, I think those simple rules work out really, really well. But in an era where everyone asks why, if nobody can give a defense of the simple rules,
exactly.
that's when we begin to run into trouble. And
Exactly.
at some point, there is and there will be, and Jordan Peterson has provided in certain ways rigorous defenses of a lot of those traditional rules and traditional reasons for doing things. There's a lot of sociological analysis that's starting to pour out now about the role that fathers play in the lives of their kids.
Yeah.
That's all very, very important. Somebody who is not within the anti-woke sphere, but who has talked about this at great length, is Dr. Anthony Bradley, who I don't know if he'd like me at all, if he'd have any use for me, but he's talked at great length about the importance of that, of fathers being involved in their kids' lives. So I think some of that the dumb guy saying, he's my son, I love him, I'm going to raise him, and the smart guy saying, yeah, he's my son, I love him, I'm going to raise him, and then the midwit saying, well, why do we need dads? Where's the scientific evidence? Um, I think there's a little bit of that going on right now, and I think that there does need to be something that connects those,
Yeah.
what you referred to earlier, what Emerson called those simple instincts, that needs to be able to connect that to reality using careful, rigorous, thoughtful methods. I
Yeah.
do think that's necessary, but I don't think that the average person needs to do a scientific investigation as to whether or not they need to be involved in their kids' lives.
Of course not.
I
No.
think the answer is so blindingly obvious to all of us that we should do what is blindingly obvious for us to be doing.
Sure, absolutely. And all I meant by that is, and I'm not someone who thinks that you can understand human beings best through coarse grain charts or number sets. I think that human beings are far more dynamic than those things. I think that human beings operate in different spheres than those things are conceived in. We're not lab rats. I think that we are all individuals imbued with free will and who make our own choices for various motivations. So I don't think that we necessarily need to have a sort of a rigorous methodological justification for everything. But I do agree with what you said. I do think that it is important to be able to explain the why. Now, how you explain the why, I think should be up to you. There should be no one. I think there are many valid ways of explaining the why. We don't just need a political scientist to explain to us why the minimum wage could be bad for businesses. We can discern that simply by being a business owner and understanding bottom lines and understanding, resource scarcity and things of that sort. So, and these are all very, I think they become intuitive things once you're involved in a certain kind of process. Um, but I just find that a lot of people, they miss the why, and that
So
scares
I'd like
me.
to say
Wokal.
something about that.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to say something about that.
Okay,
Um, the best politician, I believe, of the 20th century. Actually, I would say so far the best politician of the 21st century. Actually, um, uh, the most brilliant political thinker was Brad Wall.
okay,
People are gonna, who's that?
not
Former
familiar.
Premier of Saskatchewan and my old boss.
Oh wow, oh wow.
And he gave people, well, why was he? Did he publish great articles or write great books? No, he understood the people.
Hmm.
And one of the things he got up and said is, after a period where, between 1944 and 2007, the Conservatives in Saskatchewan had won 2 elections out of
Hmm.
17, and we needed a new direction, and he provided that. And while he was premier of our wonderful province, he gave a speech where he said that very often the center and the right have forgotten the end of the sentence. And the end of the sentence is, we need fiscal responsibility and we need economic growth because. That's the sentence. And the end of the sentence they forget. They say, because we need to win an election.
Right.
Because we want the country to be rich. No. Because we need jobs. Better, but still no. And the speech that he gave, he said, he talked about, for example, the ability of the province of Saskatchewan to ensure stable housing markets for its citizens, to pay for good public schools for our residents, to afford to provide and to ensure healthcare for the people, to make sure that the roads function, to make sure that the infrastructure is running and put together so that we can build cities and towns and communities together, so that people can get mortgages and houses and start families. That's the end of the sentence. The point is not the numbers or the charts or the markets, or the Dow Jones. It's the people. That's the end of the sentence. The young man who can afford a home so that he can get married and have a family. That's the end of the sentence. The young woman who has safe roads to travel so that she can take her children to the school. That's the end of the sentence. The couple who has children that they want to educate and can find a school in their neighborhood that is safe that they can take their children to, that those children can learn and play at. That is the end of the sentence. And far too often, right-leaning governments have forgotten what the end of the sentence is, and they think it's about numbers and GDP and record highs, and this is not the point. The end of the sentence, the markets, to quote another person who's not generally thought of as a political philosopher, but might be, the markets were made to serve people. People were not made to serve markets. And Mr. Wall understood that. Brad understood that. He got that. That we are building things for the people. That's the goal. And I think that's the most important observation in conservative politics, I think, in the last 50 years, is that conservatives have forgotten the end of the sentence. We've forgotten why we want free markets and why we want fiscal responsibility and why we want stable communities, why we used to value family and marriage. And I'm not married, but I still see marriage as a value and as something that's good, although that hasn't touched my life yet. We used to have reasons for thinking that these things were good, and we have forgotten the why. We have forgotten the end of the sentence. And at least in the political and economic realm, Mr. Wall brought back the end of the sentence. We remember why we are doing the things we are doing. We are setting up a financially stable future for the next generation so that they can have families and children and build communities. And that is the end of the sentence when we say it is important for us to make sure that we have a good, strong economy. That's the end of the sentence.
Well, I have never quite heard it explained like that before. Wow. Now, I find at the end of the sentence, however, there's a lot of debate on how to deliver that. You know, does the government deliver that? Do people themselves deliver it in the absence of government intervention and sort of positive intrusion in their lives? Positive simply means intervention, not in the sort of other sense. In the sense that a positive liberty, people would use positive. When I tend to be more sympathetic to the sort of libertarian maxim that people have the capacity, and I know that you have some critiques of libertarianism, people have the capacity to direct their own lives and flourish in their own conditions if they are not interfered with significantly by a government entity. Now, I do believe the government is necessary for a few things, and I do believe that society is also necessary as well for a few things. The natural law traditions, natural law theorists, they call this the sociability of man. the idea that man's a social animal, we go into social relationships, and that's a part of our fulfillment. It's not the whole of our fulfillment, but it's part of our fulfillment. And I believe those things are indispensable truths to any sort of attempt to get at what I believe should be our end goal, a free society. But for some people, those are very slippery, contingent goalposts that shift, that are not really rooted in anything stable. And having a government there to direct this sort of ordering of society is the primary way to have somewhat of a stable, something that resembles a sort of stable course, which is why some conservatives in America, at least, support giving tax credits to people so they can get married and start families and have babies, because they believe that necessarily that union will result in an outcome that ensures a more stable society, even though I think that kind of perspective denies the nuances and particularities of what might happen in a family. It simply looks at the form of something and says the form is good, therefore the content must be good, which I think is a little bit of a
And I think that's a case of the dumb guy and the smart guy agreeing. I think I think I think until you have your end of your sentence, until you've got your goal elevated and aiming at, I don't think that arguing over the distribution or the delivering method of those things is an exercise in futility unless you know what it is that you're trying to deliver.
interesting. Okay.
So
Okay.
if what you're trying to deliver is whatever the people want and they can solve it with the market, if that's what you're trying to deliver, well, then what you're elevating is there's no government control over that, and there's no social control over that. Um, now that might provide maximum market efficiency. It probably does provide maximum market efficiency as far as I can tell. But it will provide maximum market efficiency over what the people actually value.
Interesting. Okay.
And your conservative social philosophy will matter not at all unless the people who are implementing that free market system are social conservatives or political conservatives or philosophical conservatives of a certain stripe. It won't matter. So
Mhm.
my view is that there will be, and this is where the Canadian tradition and also the European tradition will probably break rank with the American tradition.
Yeah.
But I think that the Canadian tradition and the British tradition are recovering, or at least within those traditions are trying to recover the point of what is the end of the sentence.
Yeah.
I think a little bit of Brexit was motivated by what is the goal? Is the goal to have a maximally efficient government bureaucracy, or is there a greater goal? Is there a goal of sovereignty and of being able to make our own choices as a nation, which is more important than,
Right.
say, the ease and the simplicity of a single European passport, which we can all share?
Right.
What
Exactly.
is really what is the goal here?
Right.
Um,
And yeah.
and so I would say to my libertarian brothers and sisters that maximum market efficiency is not, as near as I can tell, the goal of anything.
Well, I agree.
I
I agree
think
with you. I agree with you.
I
I
think
agree
it's a
entirely.
tool, and
Mhm.
I think while it may be a tool worth having, it should not be the social, political, and community goal to make that the focus.
Mm.
Because if you make that the focus and the only goal, all your other stuff falls behind. This is when all of the energy of the conservative movement is put forth to protecting the libertarian economic system, there's no energy left over to go and affirm socially, politically, um, religiously, and philosophically other things which conservatives found are good. All since at least Reagan in the conservative movement, we've and particularly in America and in Canada too for a lot of years, and I would say in Britain as well. Across the board, conservatives were affirming both a sort of interventionist foreign policy and libertarian economics. And that's where all the think tank money went. That's where all the scholarship went. That's where all the legal minds went.
Yep.
All of the people involved in conservative politics were just bought in on those two things at the expense of anything to do with philosophy and culture and art. And we hollowed ourselves out when we did that. So I think that the libertarian people we might have to say to libertarian people, look, we really like your economic ideas, but man, we've got to put our money into defending our money and our resources into defending other things. And if they say,
Right.
well, you're going to lose our economic system, we've already lost our culture. The
Right.
culture of conservative
Well,
thinking is what I mean by that. Not the American culture, the Canadian culture, or anything like that. I mean
yeah.
conservative culture of conservative thinking has been hollowed out, and it wasn't hollowed out by Trump. Trump stepped into the hollowed out vacuum that was created under, in the American system, that was created under George Bush.
Right.
That was all of the resources of the social and political conservative movement in the United States went entirely to defending the Iraq War and libertarian economics. Those two things, defending tax cuts and deregulation and the Iraq War. And the fact of it is that that was a bet that they lost.
Yeah.
Betting on the Iraq War was a losing bet, and it was
Right.
wrong. They got it wrong. And now we're
Right.
seeing the fruit of that. So the conservative movement is going to have to move away from spending all of its resources on um, interventionist foreign policy and libertarian economics, unfortunately. And as much as the libertarians may not like that, um, they're in a situation right now where, well, we don't want to team. If they should decide that, well, we don't want to team up with the conservatives anymore because we're not at the front of the bus. Well, okay, but but the social conservatives and the philosophical conservatives and the cultural conservatives have sat at the back of the bus of the conservative movement for the better part of 20 years now, and there is now no longer the culture of the conservative culture of liberty that provides all the intuitive force of that libertarian economic theory is dying out.
Yeah.
So if you're not down to defend that, then you're going to lose anyway.
Yeah. So, and I want to move on to the critical theory stuff in a little bit, but if I might tease this out a little bit, tease this part out a little bit, if you don't mind. I would be very skeptical of any libertarian, any American libertarian that proclaimed to be for the fullness of liberty and didn't care about culture and solely care about economics. I think that sometimes that is the caricature that is painted of libertarians, that they just care about economics and money. But I think most libertarian theorists who have touched on economics care about it because they understand that economics is one of many ways, but a very powerful way of measuring a human's ability to flourish and voluntarily cooperate. And flourishing and voluntary cooperation necessitate certain cultural mores and standards. And I think the libertarian would argue, at least I would argue for myself, that those cultural mores and standards need not come from violence or force. They need to come from intellectual force, which can happen, and again, in a voluntary and peaceful way. So I don't think it's so much that libertarian is unconcerned about culture, or they're solely concerned about maximization of profits. I think the libertarian is concerned about the maximization of human potential, if anything else. Now, sorry, go on.
No, I mean,
No?
I'm not gonna completely disagree, but how do I say this? Again, in the United States, the way this has actually been walked out is for the libertarians to say, do what you want. It's your life. I don't want to make your
Well,
decisions for you. That's been how they've argued that publicly, and that's been the culture they've defended.
right.
And so that sort of do what you will, whatever set up whatever good for yourself that you want. The government shouldn't interfere. that's all well and good, but that society will be anarchic unless there's certain social mores that are
Of
brought in
course.
to bear.
Of
And
course.
so again, this is a case where it's the delivery system for all of this and the distribution system for all of this is irrelevant until we set up the
Yeah.
target, the goal, the thing that we're aiming at.
Yeah.
So I think that has to be set up first and elevated first. And that's the thing where we've, in the conservative political movement, because of the way the libertarians have, at least thus far, argued it, they've seen the conservative movement as a purely political thing and then say, well, join whatever things you want. And
Yeah.
it's like,
And
but in terms of government, the primary goal is to get government out of the lives of people. That's the primary political move of the conservative movement, and all of the conservative movement should be generated towards that and that political end. That's how that was argued, and that's a
right.
mistake. So
Right.
yes, I think that there would be a lot of libertarian theorists who on a social level might disagree, but when it comes to how they walk out their politics, it very much is all of the political energy must be generated into deregulation. And then when it comes to actually building social structures, they say, well, build whatever ones you want. And it's like, no, there's no coherent movement here. You've
Well,
dissolved your coherent movement.
so libertarian ethics is largely, and I think this a biographer of one of the three theories of libertarianism, Isabel Patterson, Stephen Cox, he put this to me in an email. He said it's apodictic. I think that's what the word he used. It's primarily, based on things that are, what libertarians hold to be self-evidently true, and then there's the obligation that goes ahead and says, okay, you cannot violate these things that are self-evidently true. Now, of course, the problem with this is it doesn't really provide a detailed social framework, whereas conservatism may provide a detailed social framework. And I would agree with you, Wokal. The libertarian movement, whatever that might be, whether it's the party, whether it's Gary Johnson fighting for carbon taxes while at the same time professing liberty, whatever it is, I think they have been terrible messengers on the
Okay.
issue of liberty in general. And I think libertarianism is also something that has crept its way into the libertarian movement and is kind of trying to use the message of liberty to justify things that may be of bad moral character, and I'm against all of that. Now,
Okay, so you're saying you would argue that the libertarian movement has been corrupted by a sort of libertine
part of it has, not
indiv-
all of it.
part of it.
Part of it
Okay,
has. Part of it has, not
that's
all of it.
that's that's a fair criticism. I would see that. Yeah,
Yeah, part
I
of it.
could. I don't know that I necessarily could. I mean, I'm not well versed enough in American libertarian
Yeah,
politics to make it an absolute judgment on that, but I could see that
yeah,
happening. I could
yeah.
see where that would show up.
I think part of it absolutely has. Look, you can't have liberty without having virtue. You can't have any kind of free society without having a culture that supports that, in my opinion. So that's
Okay.
very important for me, and that's why I'm a conservatarian. That's what I call myself. I do believe that moral character and virtue are very important forces to get us to have a coherent sense of liberty. And so I would entirely agree with you on that one. And I think that it's this sort of bastardization of libertarianism, which was pushed in the Reagan administration. Not to be too critical against Reagan, but this sort of pseudo laissez-faire idea that wasn't really, in my opinion, a really good enactment of libertarian principles was pushed. It was pushed without really doing everything that idea entailed. So this is David Stockman, who was Reagan's Office of Management and Budget Director during his administration. He said, Reagan wants to cut all these taxes, but he doesn't want to cut spending. He wants to keep spending in all these different areas, and he wants to keep doing these sort of military campaigns. And this is not going to be a stable. This is not a way to enact the ideas he wants to enact. And of course, you had people like Buckley who were speaking in Reagan's ears, trying to instill certain ideas in him that were more liberty infused, but there were a lot of different forces at play there. And I think that you're right. That stuff has caused a lot of damage. The sort of hybrid form of libertarian economics being pushed through the Reagan administration, at least, did cause a lot of damage. I would agree with you. And it's. I really wish that these principles had a chance to grow as they were meant to grow, not grow in an artificial way. But I think that politics has a way of making certain principles that we may think are very good in theory wretched in practice, because I think politics taints principles with temporal considerations. Because I do believe that principles of libertarian economics are based off of what the theorists believe to be universal or natural considerations. And when the natural meets the political, all kind of other things get wrapped up in that ball, and the corruption begins to happen, in my opinion. But I didn't expect us to go very long about this, but sorry. Let me move back on over to critical theory, right? Critical race theory. I appreciate you entertaining that thought, because I find it very important to tease that kind of stuff out in the framework of the conversation. So, we've discussed the foundations of our belief. We discussed all that kind of stuff. But one thing is for certain: this sort of push of anti-normativity threatens everything we just talked about. We couldn't even have that kind of discussion if the woke got what they wanted. That kind of discussion that we just had is a discussion that would, in their opinion, erase the contributions and subjective experiences of Black and brown bodies, that they would say, of queer bodies, because all of that stuff we just talked about is about principles. It's about practical life. It's about just doing things that we are intuitively attuned to. And none of that, in their opinion, would occur in a framework that takes into account the experiences of different people. When you speak in universals, you don't really take into account, in my opinion, the sort of subjective experiences of certain people. The woke like to use the standpoint epistemology stuff, Well, I'm queer and Black and trans, and therefore my understanding of knowledge, my truth, so to speak, is much more coherent and better than whatever anyone can tell me. And bless you. And I was no problem. And I was exploring a queer theory journal, a queer theory article actually the other day on JSTOR, and I didn't know very much about queer theory. I knew I had an interaction with it when I was in collegiate debate, because in collegiate debate, what all these people do is just,
How was it?
What's that? What's that?
How was the paper?
Oh my God. So the
Yeah.
author,
Yes.
so the author said that gay men need to embrace bareback sex and become sex pigs as a means of disrupting normativity. The, he also said
Well,
that he mentioned
that's par for
he
the course.
he detailed his experience attending a group sex session, and how that experience kind of made him want to be a queer theory activist. And I recently made a video commenting about queer theory in light of the recent San Francisco Gay Men's Course's claim, song that they were going to convert the children and all that kind of stuff. And I said, guys, queer theory is a thing that actually does want to convert people, actually does want to, implement certain ideas that are against normativity. Now, just to be fair, there are queer theorists that do not believe in anti-normativity. There are queer theorists like that, but I think most of them do believe in anti-normativity. And so I guess
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, I would disagree. I would say that queer theory, right to its core, is anti-essentialist, right to its bones.
Oh, you believe so? Okay. So if any claim that says so to the contrary by queer theorists it's just not true.
They would say, if they would, their normativity would be an anti-essentialist normativity. It
Okay.
would be the only norm could be that we don't have any stable long-term essentialist categories.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
they would say they might be able to eke out a sort of pale form of a norm, but that norm would only be in the service of something that is absolutely anti-essentialist.
Okay.
There could be some exception somewhere, but in academic places, I mean, if you want to look at, say, somebody like Gail Rubin or Jack Halberstram or any of those people, you're gonna find pure postmodern anti-essentialism right to its core.
Okay.
So they're going to, yeah. I would say that the queer theorists, whatever norms they eke out, are going to be absolutely anti-essentialist, right stripped right down to its bones, like right through to the core.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And so, as someone who has gone up against all these ideologies of anti-normativity and everything, and in different settings, because in collegiate debate, all collegiate debate in America is people reading cards, evidence cards from people like Wilderson, the Afro-pessimist guy, Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Delgado, Judith Butler, all these people. That's all it is, really. That's really all it is. And I didn't do that. I was arguing that, truth is objective, and, liberty matters and virtue matters and character matters, which is why I wasn't really, they didn't really like me all over there. But that's a different story for a different day. But I was wondering, in our discourse today, a lot of resentment against critical race theory and critical queer theory and any other critical theory that has come under the spotlight because of your excellent work and of James Lindsay's work and everything. It has been deemed as Marxist. The resentment is against the Marxism of these ideas. And you'll have people like Sam Holt-Lieberil, who I had the opportunity to debate in a recent panel about critical race theory, who would say, well, there's nothing about critical race theory that is Marxist. Even when you point out the dialectic between oppressor and oppressed, and how, Marx also had that same dialectic. So how would you respond to claims that critical queer theory, critical race theory, none of it is Marxist? And how would you respond to claims that things like the 1619 Project are also not critical race theory, even though they clearly use critical race theory methodology? How do you respond to those claims?
Well, I think on the one hand, they've set themselves up a wonderful little scenario in which every single nuance separates every single idea by an iron line of demarcation which can never be crossed, ever. Every slight nuance requires a fresh and new analysis.
Interesting.
Whereas all conservative ideas that are even vaguely similar can get thrown in together and dismissed for the same reasons. That's generally how that goes. So critical race theory opposition and QAnon activism can just get tossed in the same boat, right? That's how that's working out at the moment. So that's the game that's being played there. So I would point that out first, and then I would point out that Kimberly Crenshaw herself said that Marxism was worked into critical race theory. And I would say, see, now they're going to come back with an interview from 2008 where Derek Bell said that he never read Marx. And Derek Bell's work was instrumental in kicking off critical race theory. It wasn't called that until probably 1987, when Kimberly Crenshaw held the first kind of conference on critical race theory. But Derek Bell was writing about stuff that was in the vicinity, in the philosophical and intellectual vicinity of what is now critical race theory, starting probably in 1973 with racism and American law. So I would say that, well, yeah, Derek Bell might have provided the inspiration in the kickoff. It's absolutely the case that critical theory and the methods of critical theory are used in critical race theory, and critical theory comes directly out of neo-Marxism.
Yep.
So the little game that's being played here is that every single left-wing idea must be treated individually and with the maximum amount of nuance. You can't, Marxism as an idea is separated by an iron and titanium wall reinforced with concrete that separates that between Marxism and critical theory. They're not the same thing. You can't talk about them the same thing. That's lazy thinking. Whereas, I'm against critical theory. Well, that's like QAnon. So this is silly. It's a silly language game on some level, and some people are playing a silly language game, and they need to be called out for it. You don't get to demand that left-wing ideas be treated according to the most nuanced instance that happens in the academy, and demand that the political left be defined by its most rigorous and nuanced academic ideas, and then say that you're going to judge conservatives by the stupidest person who shows up at the meeting. Like that's not how we do things. That's ridiculous.
Yes.
Then I would say there is an intellectual lineage that is kind of kicked off with Marx, but for the most part, critical race theory while, as Kimberly Crenshaw says, absolutely does make use of some Marxist ideas, for the most part, it's building on critical theory, which is neo-Marxist, or which is kind of, if you think of Marx and Engels as being the first generation of Marxism, critical theory is like generation 2 or 3, or maybe even
Yeah,
generation 4 of the
kind of
iteration of
like
Marxism.
Gramsci and
It's
all of them, right?
evolved a long way. Yeah,
Kind of
it's
like
evolved a lot. Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, it's
Masochism.
evolved a long way.
Mhm.
So you could think of it as like, I mean, if Abraham Lincoln is a particular generation of republicanism, and Ronald Reagan's a different generation of republicanism, there's a big gap between Lincoln
Oh
and
yeah,
Reagan.
oh
I
yeah,
mean, there's some common principles for sure, but there's a big gap. And you could say the same thing for critical theory and Marxism,
yeah,
that they would say that they are taking their inspiration and drawing some of their ideas from Marx's injunction that we rigorously criticize everything. That would be, they certainly would accept that, but they would have moved far beyond Marx's analysis of economics and political economy.
of course. It's
So they're moving a long way along. So they would say, well, it's not straight Marxism. That's true,
right.
but it takes up certain tenets of Marxism, particularly conflict theory and the ruthless criticism of everything. And it does make use of those. And it does make use of some, I mean, people talk about the oppressor oppressed thing. Yes, but also Marx's idea about analyzing economic interests, but they would have moved that beyond Marx's
Yeah,
vulgar economic analysis. So
and more to a
there's a
racial
connection.
dimension.
They they would have gone. I mean, by the 30s and 40s, the critical theorists were already
Right,
looking at
right.
culture and social things. By the time Marcuse writes Essay on Liberation, which is a book I've just finished reading, um, or looking at again, maybe is a better way to say it. Is that a better way to say it? I don't know. I I went through and did some highlighting and some notes for whatever that's worth.
Right.
And having read the whole thing and now taken notes on it, um, he has moved way, way beyond the pure Marxism of,
Right.
say, Das Kapital.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think there's a connection certainly between Marxism and critical race theory. But I think that critical race theory is takes in a whole bunch of leftist academic
Yeah.
ideas that it's pulled out of critical theory that the left has been generating since Marx,
Yeah.
and some of which have nothing to do with Marx. So we have to be careful when we say that critical race theory is pure Marxism, because
Right.
it's not, and it's not in that sense Marxism.
Yeah.
It does have certain elements that are
Traits.
grafted into the lineage
Yeah.
from Marxism and traits of Marxism,
So yeah.
particularly its emphasis on conflict theory and the ruthless
Yeah.
criticism of everything. But it's not pure Marxism. That would be a mistake to
Yeah,
think that.
absolutely. And there are, I mean, just beyond the Marxist, I think there are plenty of good critiques to be made against critical race theory on its own. Its rejection of normativity, its emphasis on standpoint epistemology, its and all this kind of stuff. All that stuff is very, it's reductionism. All that kind of stuff is very, it's out there. It
Yes.
stands alone, and it can be attacked, I think, without appealing to Marx. But yeah,
Yeah.
you know, I I used to call critical race theory a sort of a philosophy of race essentialism, and when now
Yeah.
now
In
I
a
was
certain, it's in a twisted way.
Yeah.
In a twisted way.
No,
Yeah. Yeah. In a twisted way, it kind of does have that to it. But
I was met with a rejection that said that critical
yeah.
race theory does reject the sort of essentialization of any one particular identity, which it does. It's heavily influenced by intersectionality, but it still seems to make race the primary ingredient of its social analysis. And that's the way I was using essentialism. Now, was I using it the wrong way? Or because I have gotten different responses. Folks have been saying, yeah, no, you use it the right way. Other folks are saying, no, you got the definition completely wrong. How would you have described it better?
Oh, how do I put this? I want to be careful how I put this.
Yeah.
I want to be very precise.
Okay.
Is this a phone?
Yes. As
This
far
is
as
a
I can
phone.
see. As far as I can see, yeah.
If I compared that to the old landline that when I was a really little boy, my grandpa had with the ring on it, where you had to like go.
The rotary phone. Yeah.
Yeah, the old rotary phones that you see in the old movies. That's not this, but this fulfills the same role.
Yeah.
It connects me to people so I can talk to them. Is it a phone? Not like that's a phone, but it is a phone.
Yeah.
In a certain way. It's a cellular phone.
Yeah.
It's a smartphone. But that phone portion of it is still there.
Yeah.
And I would say that in the same way that this is not straightforwardly the rotary phone, critical race theory is not straightforwardly essentialist, but it does the same thing as essentialism.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense.
So the way that they do it is they get out of it by saying we believe identity is entirely socially constructed. Right there. I'm not an essentialist. Okay. But then they have a doctrine of standpoint epistemology. And their doctrine of social construction says, if you are white, or if you are black, or if you are whatever race you are socialized into a certain, you are conditioned and socialized to accept your role within a particular position in society.
Mm-hmm.
You've been socialized and conditioned in particular ways based upon your race.
Mm.
So if you are a white person, you've been socialized into whiteness. If you are a black person, you've been socialized into blackness. If you are Native American, you've been socialized into nativeness or whatever have you, or into indigenousness. That socialization process forms you and makes you who you are as a person in many ways.
Yep.
And so while my whiteness is not biologically built into me,
Right.
they would say that whiteness, that I have been socialized into whiteness. And the only way for me to remove my whiteness from myself,
Yeah.
the only way to avoid that is to deconstruct my whiteness, to decolonize myself,
Yeah.
to, what's that word they like to use? There's a phrase for it now. What's it called? Do the work. I have to do the work.
Yeah.
So that I can, I have to, become an anti-racist. I have to do the work of the anti-racism and the decolonization of myself, so
Yeah.
that I can stop participating in the system of whiteness that perpetuates and reinscribes the power relations which oppress black and brown bodies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? This is all very familiar to us now. So let me just see if I can find something here.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and find, I did an explanation on this really recently that I actually like.
There's a through line.
There it is.
Not to interrupt you or get you off track, but there's a through line between the sort of critical standpoint epistemology, the decolonization of the self, the sort of decolonialization of our understandings of knowledge, and the groundwork that takes place right after that, anti-racism. So these things are indeed related, because one attempts to reach the conclusion of the first. The premise is critical race theory, and anti-racism is attempting to reach the conclusion of critical race theory. Would you think that's correct? Because Kendi has said that critical race theory is indispensable to his mission.
Yeah, they kind of play this game with it, where on the one hand he'll say, I'm inspired by critical race theory and it's indispensable. On the other hand, he'll say, well, I'm not a, that's only in law schools. So it's a little bit of playing both sides of it. I would say that the ideas of critical race theory have cross-pollinated pretty broadly in the entirety of anti-racism. I would say that the cynical, pessimistic views of the utterly critical race theory movement, particularly from Derek Bell, but also from what a lot of what Mary Matsuda was writing in
Oh God,
Looking to the Bottom.
that woman is terrible.
And yeah,
That
yeah,
woman.
it's
Uh, I saw her
all,
rejection of the First Amendment and against free speech. That lady wants to create a dictatorship.
yeah, and was that in Words That Wound that you
Words,
found that?
that wound. Yes, yeah, words that wound. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The notion of assaultive speech, all of that stuff. I mean, if you trace back that notion of assaultive speech and Words That Wound right up to the idea that words are violent, you find it right there. Like there's obviously a connection there. The legal argument that words can be considered assaultive speech, or the principles that could be used in bringing that legal argument to fruition or making that legal argument, are found in Words That Wound. That's a CRT document, or a
Mm-hmm.
CRT text, or CRT book, or CRT anthology.
Yep.
It's right there. That's 1992, 93 that book was written. Yeah, I think that that critical race theory, the tenets of critical race theory, have cross-pollinated through the entire anti-racist movement, particularly on the left and even in the center. I would say that that those concepts, that those ideas, if you read Stefancic and Delgado's book Critical Race Theory and Introduction, the set of concepts that they lay out there in terms of things like interest convergence and revisionist history and all of that deeply cynical, kind of pessimistic stuff is rife. So yeah, I think that critical race theory has, and its tenets have cross-pollinated, and it's critical race theory, even if it's mixed in. The sugar that I put into the cake doesn't cease to be sugar because it's mixed with the milk and eggs and flour.
Right, and just and also, so another reference that I draw from Masuda. She also wrote a paper. I'm looking at it right now in 1989 for the Michigan Law Review called "Public Response to Racist Speech: Considering the Victim's Story," in which again she uses this sort of standpoint epistemology stuff that she talked about in Words That Wound to justify completely and utterly revision. She's not revisioning, reworking and reframing the American conception of free expression. So that's also a place where she does that, and that's like I think like a few page paper, like a 62-page paper, where she argues that. I mean, that lady. People always say read the critical race theorists, and they're not saying this kind of stuff. You read Masuda's 62-page paper. If you just like the first 2 pages, 3 pages of it, she's like, yeah, the First Amendment is wrong about free speech. Expression is not supposed to be this unabated thing. It needs to be controlled. They're not hiding it.
Yeah.
And that can be found on Jay's store, Public Response to Racist Speech, Considering the Victim's Story.
Hold on one second. There was an article. Let me just see if I can find it. Just give me one second. War of Words, Critical Race Theory and the First Amendment. And that is by Henry Louis Gates Jr. And he discusses this as well. And one of the things that he points out, amongst other things, if I've remembered the article precisely correctly, is that he says all of these people who are pushing this stuff don't realize that as soon as the First Amendment is pulled back on, the first people that are going to be told to shut up are them.
Yes, exactly.
Right? That's how that's going to work.
Yep.
People don't recognize that as soon as you pull back the First Amendment, it's that protection that protected you is now gone.
Yeah.
We forget this at our own peril. So the critical race theorists seem to think of, once we get rid of that's assaultive speech. Hey, Matsuda, do you doubt my white Christian evangelical God? Because that's my identity is based on that. That's assault of speech. If you deny do you deny the birth of death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? That's assault of speech. Do you, and you could think of how this could go on endlessly.
Yes.
Do you deny the Prophet Muhammad? Yes, that's assault of speech. Do you deny the Jewish scriptures? Does that, every single religion is going to start saying, well, oh, you don't believe in Zoroastrianism. You're condemning people to an eternity of hellfire. That's assault of speech. What? You don't think that the Atman is the Brahman? That's assault of speech. I mean, we can go on all day long about this. So, no, that's a move that they think they might want to make, but they're going to find out very quickly that that's not a move that's a lot of fun for them. That move doesn't work out for anybody. It never has. It's not going to start now. Like that's gonna be. I'd be against that.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I think you're right. I think that, I mean, a CRT does this thing, and a lot of the CRT theorists do this thing where when they're pushed on CRT, the only thing that counts as CRT is like the most is if it wasn't published with the name critical race theory on the cover and it's not an academic source, then it doesn't count as critical race theory. And
Yeah.
again, this is like saying that the sugar stops being sugar because it's mixed into the cake. That's not correct.
Yeah.
It's the tenets of critical race theory are the yeast and the bread of the political left right now. And that's something that they're going to have to either lean into or lean out of, but it's not something that can be denied for much longer. People know.
Well, I could talk to you for hours, man. I think we have been talking for about an hour. Look, I just wanted to thank you again for being here, for agreeing to have this conversation.
Yeah.
I hope that you'll come back one day.
Can I read something? I just want to pull out something because you
Yes,
asked about
please.
structural determinant
Please, absolutely.
about that.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna
Yes.
I found this here.
Please.
So the way that some of these theorists will say, you know, white people all need to decolonize themselves or whatever, and then say, but we're not racial determinists or we're not racial essentialists. And you kind of go, how do that work? So I'll just read something here. All facets of society and the whole of society itself are structured to produce certain outcomes. In their view, everything that makes up the social world is structured to produce particular outcomes. CRT thinks everything in society is structured to produce white dominance. As such, all the elements of society are working to socialize and continue and condition everyone to accept a hierarchy of white dominance. Since the white person on this view is at the top of the hierarchy, they cannot know what it's like to be at the bottom. So they are everywhere and always being socialized into a worldview of white dominance and don't have any experience of what it's like to be on the bottom of that. People of color can be socialized and conditioned to believe that they are inferior to white people. If that conditioning occurs, it's called internalized oppression. However, CRT thinks that people of color can escape the conditioning in a way white people can't. So they would say that a black person who accepts these false view of themselves has internalized their own oppression. But they also believe that they can escape that, and they do so in a way that doesn't apply to white people. White people have no lived experience, which would allow them to understand the difference between how white people and black people are treated. And as a result of that, where people of color can experience themselves as not being inferior to whites, and then compare that experience to the racist messaging of society, white people have no experience of that sort. So the person of color has a sort of double consciousness where they know what society tells them, but they also have the experience of not living in that society. And so they have the experience of seeing where this socialization is wrong. And they would say white people don't have that double consciousness, and so can't see that.
This sounds
and
a
they
lot
can't
like
draw the comparison.
sounds a lot like W.E.B. Du Bois's point about the black double consciousness. Du Bois made the
Yeah,
point.
they would. They would explicitly draw on Du Bois for that. But they would take Du Bois' point and put that and apply his point and try and make that have coherency with the postmodern view of identity.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
So there's nothing in the experience of white person which can tip them off or wake them up or let them see the way in which they've been conditioned and the way that society has been structured to benefit them. The only way for a white person to see it is to have it pointed out by somebody else. The white person doesn't have the double consciousness, so the white person can't see these various things unless somebody else comes along and points it out to them. This means that unless someone else sort of wakes a white person up to the way that everything in society is structured for their benefit, they have no way of even knowing all of this is going on. Hence the word woke. You have to be woke and awake to the systems of power that are socializing and structuring all of society, socializing and conditioning people and structuring all of society.
Right.
So CRT says that if you're a white, it's almost impossible for you to not have been socialized and conditioned into a racist worldview. And the only way out is through the praxis of doing the work to unlearn your racist programming. So even if you do all that, you may never escape your racist biases and programming. So now, when you say that CRT says all white people are inherently X, Y, Z, they're all inherently racist, they dodge that charge by saying that CRT does not claim that racism is inherent to white people. It's a bit of a technicality.
Exactly.
CRT doesn't say that racism is built into white people biologically, but it does say that any person with white skin that is born in Western society is conditioned and socialized with racist messaging to be racist, whether they know it or not, and they can't escape that socialization.
Implicit
So while it's
bias.
technically true, yeah. So while they'll have implicit bias by virtue of that socialization process, right?
Yeah.
The biases are socialized and conditioned into them. So while it's technically true that CRT doesn't say that racism is built into the biology of white people, CRT does say that society conditions and socializes all white people into a racist worldview, which, while being technically different, gives us the same result, that all white people are racist. So when some CRT defender denies that CRT says all people are racist, just be aware that that's true on a technicality, and that for all practical purposes, CRT is going to end up saying that almost always white people have been socialized and conditioned into a particular white supremacist worldview, even if it's not inherent into their biology.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's how they would handle that.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
There it is.
Well, Wokal, look, I hope that you'll come back. I hate to end this so abruptly. I would normally go further, but I have prior obligations. But
Okay.
this has been a fascinating conversation. You have anything you'd like to say to me or the viewers before you go?
No, I'm glad to have been here, and I hope that somebody can get something out of our conversation.
Well, as do I. Where can folks find you?
I have a YouTube channel, Wokal Distance. It's only got 2 videos. I'm not really producing YouTube content at the moment. Every once in a while, if I have a video, it'll go up, but that's not usually where people find me. It's more on Twitter at Wokal_Distance. That's
I think
my main spot.
I think you should start producing more YouTube content, dude. I do. It's my personal opinion. I think that you should really start doing that if you want to. I mean,
we'll see if time allows.
All right. Well, everyone, stay pensive. Bye-bye.